Ocean protection is a key tool in managing oceans and its resources, and it requires the support of all ocean users. But there's one group that's often ignored or left out of the process that can play a key role in protecting the oceans effectively. Indigenous groups have been protecting their oceans and lands for thousands of years and need to be included in the conversations. So today I'm joined by Hamna Sharif of the National Ocean Protection Coalition and Angelo Gomez of the Center of American Progress to discuss ways in which scientists, NGOs, and governments can support Indigenous-led conservation. That's on this episode of the Speak Up for the Ocean Blue podcast. Let's start the show. Hey everybody, welcome back to another exciting episode of the Speak Up for the Ocean Blue podcast. I am your host, Andrew Lewin, and this is the podcast where you find out what's happening in the ocean, what you can do to speak up for the ocean, and how you can live for a better ocean by taking action. And normally I talk more about how to speak up for the ocean, and this is, in a way, this episode is how to speak up for the ocean, but it's ways that other people can be involved in ocean protection. Normally, I'd put this on a Friday episode where we talk about action, but because it's close to Christmas, a lot of people may not be listening to as much to the podcast. We're going to flip the script. We're going to put it in to today's episode, which I think is perfect because I want people to listen to this. This is a very important subject matter. And when I saw the article on AmericanProgress.org about 5 ways scientists, NGOs, governments can support Indigenous-led conservation, I thought, hey, you know what? I'm going to reach out to my good buddy Angelo Villagomez. He brought on his colleague and friend Hamna Sharif, and we are going to talk about this a little bit more in more detail because it's not often where you have a symposium at a conference that is so important as this one, right? When we're hearing from Indigenous people from all over the U.S. talk about their experiences and what they want to be able to talk about or be able to do when it comes to conservation. Having these conversations is a big, big step in inclusion. And I think this is great, and I look forward to seeing more of these conversations. But Hamna was the moderator at the symposium. Angelo was one of the speakers and helped organize. They both helped organize it. Angelo sits on the committee for the National Ocean Protection Coalition, as well as Hamna works for them. And so it is great to have them both on to talk about the symposium. What were the major outcomes? What was the major finding out of all this, which I think was really, really interesting, which has to do with the articles that was kind of separate. The themes that were taken out of this weren't found until afterward. They weren't told to hit on a specific themes. It just naturally, organically came out. So here's the interview with Hamna and Angelo talking about their symposium and talking about Indigenous-led conservation and how scientists, NGOs, and governments can support Indigenous-led conservation. Enjoy the interview, and I will talk to you after. Hey, Angelo. Hey, Hamna. Welcome to the Speak Up for the Ocean Blue podcast. Are you ready to talk about Indigenous-led conservation for the oceans?
Absolutely.
I was born ready.
Nice. I love it. I love that energy. Listen, I am so happy to have both of you on the podcast. One of the reasons why we're here, not just because I like having you on the podcast, but also because we have an article that both of you published, and I'm looking on it here on the AmericanProgress.org website, and it's 5 ways scientists, NGOs, and governments can support Indigenous-led conservation. And this is an article that was sort of one of the results of a symposium that you put on and you attended earlier this year, talking about Indigenous-led conservation and having a lot of conversations on that. And this is what I love. Obviously, I have a podcast, so I love talking about this type of information. So we're here to talk about the results and sort of the whole process and what was talked about and what we need to take as sort of take-home messages for this when we talk about ocean conservation. So welcome to the both of you. People know Angelo. He's been on the podcast for quite a long time. So Angelo, we're going to start with Hamna today. Hamna, why don't you talk about, or why don't you tell us who you are and what you do?
Yes, happy to. Hi, everyone. My name is Hamna Sharif. I am the Government Relations Manager at the National Ocean Protection Coalition. Our coalition is a nonprofit group, and we work to create and support effective and equitable marine protected areas. Marine protected areas are special places in the ocean set aside for their biodiversity, climate, and cultural benefits, much like national parks on land. So, our coalition brings together people with diverse backgrounds from different cultures and geographies and lived experiences who are committed to protecting our one and only ocean from human caused stressors and the impacts of climate change. I wear lots of different hats in my day to day role, and it is a super fun and exciting space to be a part of. Thank you for having me, Andrew.
You bet. It sounds like a super exciting space to be. It seems like this space is becoming more and more important, and discussed. To have somebody in a role like yours, in an organization like yours, it didn't seem like that was going on, 10, 20 years ago, from what I can remember. So it's really great to see the emergence of this type of role, and I've seen more and more conversations around it. So that's great, and we'll get into that in just a little bit. Angela, why don't you just remind people who you are and what you do?
Sure. So Humna was talking about wearing different hats. So with the, I'm actually a member of the National Ocean Protection Coalition. Well, actually, the Center for American Progress is a member of NOPC, but I'm also on the leadership team. So I work with Humna and the team and help guide the overall national coalition. And NOPC does incredible work, and they're doing great things. But the job that pays the bills for me is I work for an organization in Washington D.C. called the Center for American Progress. I'm a senior fellow, which is sort of like almost it's like an academic or a scholar position. And what I do is I support efforts to protect nature and to make it more just in the United States. And in particular, I'm very focused on the America the Beautiful initiative, which is the United States particular version of 30 by 30. The thing that makes the U.S. different is that the America the Beautiful initiative sort of has like three legs to its stool. It's about protecting 30 by 30, but it's also about climate change, and it's also about improving access to nature for all Americans.
It seems like when I started 20 years ago in marine protected areas and learning about marine protected areas, the focus, a lot of the focus was on getting these areas protected as much as possible. And people had different methods for it, but it was really focused on the biology aspect of it. And it seemed like there were a lot of sort of stakeholder engagement meetings, and people would come together and a process would happen, and then once the process was done, they the government would, of all places around the world, would make announcements of these sort of large marine protected areas, and a lot of those, Angela, you were a part of, or some of them you were a part of, especially the larger ones. But there were some that were going on, and I'm thinking of the and I don't remember the exact name, but there was the California marine protected areas, and like along the west coast of the U.S. And I remember specifically after that process was done, a lot of the indigenous people came out and said they didn't feel like they were a part of the process. They felt like they were outsiders. They didn't feel like they had a lot of say in what was going on and what was going to be the resulting sort of MPAs that we see here and today. And I don't know if they've changed since that time. But now a lot of the focus is less on the area of protection, or I guess there's still a focus on that, but the biology, but a lot of it's on the social and economic aspect of it, which wasn't really the focus when I was involved. That's changed a lot over the years, and it continues to change. And now we're really focusing, and we've seen conversations, which it will be the basis of this conversation, which is Indigenous-led conservation. And so can you just kind of give us a breakdown of what Indigenous-led conservation is, not necessarily a definition, but just of what it is in particular, and then how that's changed over the years.
Sure, Hamna. So if you don't mind, I'll take this one first. First of all, Andrew, I want to say I love that you can now say 20 years ago, as if you had that experience from 20 years ago. And your listeners may not know this, but you and I are like 3 weeks apart in age.
Yes.
We were both born in the 1970s, just weeks apart.
Yeah.
You bring up a very important aspect of conservation in the United States, and it's this idea that conservation has changed and evolved over like every 20 or 30 years. The focus of conservation really changes in this country. And, going back to the late 1800s with transcendentalism and its connections to God. But, at the time of like Teddy Roosevelt, when he was creating the first national parks, no one was talking about biodiversity. We were protecting areas like we, the United States of America, were creating scenic landscapes so that
Mm-hmm.
Ansel Adams could go there and take pictures. But then with Silent Spring and Aldo Leopold, this focus on wildlife came to overtake scenic landscapes. And you and I grew up in the 80s and 90s, and back then it was about save the rainforest, save the whales, and most recently, I would actually say climate change has kind of overtaken the biodiversity aspects, where you see a lot of discussion around protecting nature, talked about in terms of its the carbon output. So I sometimes laugh to myself. I'm like, did the scenic landscape people feel the same way about wildlife, the way that I feel about this change to climate and just how it's morphed and it's changed? And in the wake of George Floyd, everybody probably remembers the summer of 2020. Um, People became so much more important in conservation, and this idea of access, and the inclusion of indigenous peoples, and a lot of large NGOs kind of reassessed their history, and took a look back at did we actually write down history the way it really happened? And oftentimes the answer has been no, it hasn't. And just to talk about like the importance of indigenous peoples to conservation, God, there's been a couple of studies, and sometimes I get the numbers a little bit wrong, but like indigenous peoples make up about 5% of the globe, but about 80% of biodiversity is on their lands, of the last remaining biodiversity.
Mm-hmm.
And they make up about a quarter, or they own or they lay claim to about a quarter of the terrestrial surface, but about 40% of the protected areas in the world today are on indigenous lands. And if you think about this, like the reason indigenous peoples exist is because somebody stole their land. When the last 500 years, when Europeans came to the United States, and the rest of the Americas, and stole indigenous lands and pushed indigenous peoples to the margins of society, and that just happens to be where like a lot of the nature is, because the places that were the most valuable, the most economically valuable lands are our cities today. So I haven't gotten to your answer of what is indigenous-led conservation. I've just sort of painted a picture of
Mm-hmm.
how the focus of conservation has changed, and in the last couple of years, the conservation community has come to really understand the importance of indigenous peoples and the stewardship that they have had over nature for the last, not just 500 years of colonialization, but for the last 14,000 years as they've lived on this land. But there's also this like great diversity of thought when it comes to indigenous peoples, and just diversity of cultures. And indigenous peoples live in the Arctic, they live in the
Mm-hmm.
tropics, they live out in rural communities, with like way out there, but they also live in urban communities. So there's uh, different relationships to nature depending on the geography. Whether you're an island person or a mountain person, your culture expresses it differently. So conservation will express itself differently. Um, but understanding the importance of indigenous people means that we have to, as a conservation community, we have to spend time exploring indigenous concepts of conservation because it's worked for so long, for so many
Mm-hmm.
years. And that was kind of the inspiration behind the symposium that we held in Puerto Rico. And nobody else has had a chance to talk, so I'll just sort of describe the sort of like the genesis of what this conference is going to be. So the SACNAS conference is the Society for the Advancement of Chicanos and Native Americans in Science, and it's a science conference, but it's like the National Diversity and STEM conference. So it's not just biology; it's also math and health and physics
Hmm.
and all those other things. It's a place where there's going to be a lot of native and indigenous scientists. And basically, my idea was, science and conservation in the Western world are so tied together. So why don't we have a symposium where we'll bring a bunch of native and indigenous leaders who work in conservation with the federal government, and we'll sort of sit down in a circle and talk story about the different ways that we engage in conservation, whether you're a tribal chief or you work in philanthropy or you work for an NGO or you work for the government itself. And that was sort of the inspiration. And so, the way these science conferences work is like a year ago, you have to submit a proposal.
Hmm.
And then lo and behold, it got accepted. Then you have to figure out how to fly a bunch of people to Puerto Rico. So I had to reach out and call in some favors to get some people, flown down to Puerto Rico for a couple of days. But basically, what we did is we had a 90-minute symposium where we spent 60 minutes kind of letting folks just talk story about how they've engaged in conservation with the federal government from, using their indigenous identity. And then we had like a 30-minute Q&A session, and we filmed it.
Which was
That's
awesome
kind of
because you were able to post some of those talks, which was really interesting as well. Hamna, how were the speakers chosen for this symposium?
Sorry, trying to unmute myself over there.
No
Um,
worries.
so actually, Angela, I'm curious about your thoughts on this one, and then I can add.
Yeah. I'll just jump in. So we kind of called in a lot of favors. So um, been doing some work with Native Americans in philanthropy. So I said, hey, do you guys have someone that could come speak? I used to work at an organization called the Pew Charitable Trusts, and so I called some of the people I knew over there, and I said, hey, is there anybody you work with that might be interested in coming to speak with us? Basically, the way NOPC got involved is I did the same thing with them, and they had some great connections with Queen Quet, so they
Hmm.
helped get Queen Quet to come. At the last SACNAS before COVID, I was on a panel with a professor from Guam, and I reached out to him and I said, "Hey, man, I'm hosting this conference. Would one of your students like to come speak on this panel?" Um, and it was calling on my contacts and seeing who was available and then trying to figure out ways to fly everybody to Puerto Rico.
So the focus was diversity within indigenous people around the U.S. Right? Was that the idea to get their input on what their sort of conservation is?
Yeah, it was mostly focused around the United States. It wasn't meant to be international. And part of it is, the America the Beautiful initiative is just the United States.
Hmm.
And I think you can, if you are international, I think you are welcome at the SACNAS conference. But I think for the most part, it's Americans.
Now, Hamna, you moderated this session. Um,
Yes.
Tell me what that was like, and sort of the process of how it all worked.
Yeah, happy to. So I loved being a moderator and host for the session. It was an incredible opportunity to connect with our speakers and connect with scientists from all over the country. And the way it worked was we had these incredible six indigenous leaders joining us, and each of them spoke about how they bring their indigenous identity and values to the work they conduct with the federal government and with the nonprofit organizations and in different facets of conservation. So our speakers joined from all over the country and touched on their long legacy of community leadership and stewarding the lands and waters, their perspectives on things like watershed management and how they're working with the White House to advance policy. So it really was a very rich conversation. And Angela and I wrote about those five themes that emerged as our takeaways from it. But for me, it was really powerful because it was my first time moderating a panel in person in a room that highlighted only Indigenous leadership on the panel. And to be there as an organizer to host and to help bring these voices together and bring attention to the incredibly impactful work that these leaders are doing was
Hmm.
just really moving in that this is what our future can look like. So definitely had a few top takeaways. from those one-on-one conversations right before the panel. I was just so happy to see the room overflowing. As a moderator, you always want to keep your audience engaged, and
Right.
you want to provide them opportunities for those conversations, and you want to encourage them to ask those questions. I will say they needed very little help from me. It was just such a good crowd. People were sitting on the floors and leaning in the doorways, and yeah, just a really good turnout. And they had really good questions for our speakers. So we
Right.
wished we had more than 90 minutes.
Yeah, I mean, maybe the next time there'll be more. And I mean, this is one of many, I assume, conversations that are going to happen, and we'll get into sort of the next steps in just a moment. But Hamna, for you as a moderator, for being able to meet some of the speakers for the first time and so forth. I know we have the five sort of key takeaways from the symposium, but what stood out to you the most when listening to the speakers?
Yeah, so we spent a lot of time together with the panelists over the 3 days we were there. And while exploring the conference venue and the streets of San Juan with them, something that was really clear to me was the need and desire for more of these conversations and opportunities to continue having these discussions. And as Angelo said, there's a lot of exploration that needs to happen.
Mm-hmm.
And it was really clear to me that there's this super strong personal connection to nature, to how our families, ancestors, and loved ones all inspire love for the environment, and all the ways in which Indigenous communities have always been protectors, stewards, and conservationists of ecosystems. Because for them, culture, family, identity, community, and natural resources, it's all part of the same thing, and it's a much more holistic view of how we view the ecosystems around us, and they're not separate. So
Mm-hmm.
that was a big takeaway for me. And yeah, it was really great hearing them talk about their love for the environment. Really
Right.
inspiring.
Yeah, absolutely. Did they talk about did some of the speakers or any of the speakers talk about some of the frustrations that they've had in the past working with government or nonprofit organizations or scientists in terms of other conservation focused projects?
It's a great question, Andrew. There's actually sort of a plus or a minus or a positive or a negative to the way you asked your question. And you asked, Humno, like what was the one thing that emerged? And for me, the one thing that emerged was these sort of five themes
Mm-hmm.
of how to maybe think about what indigenous conservation is. Um, and the five themes are basically it's identity, knowledge, uh, values, responsibility, and advocacy, and we can get into those in a minute. But within, let me just take like a step back. So, like Andrew, you and I are very much science conference junkies, right?
Yes.
Would love going to science conferences. You want to go sit in on the shark section to find out what's going on with sharks. You want to go check in on the social scientists to see what they're talking about. And I love going to science conferences, but I also have an employer, and so does Humna. And our employers wanted us to have sort of like an outcome document. So,
Mm-hmm.
we didn't start the five. We didn't talk about the five themes at the conference. It only emerged after we left, and we started looking at the notes, and we were like, looking literally at the specific quotes that the people said, and we started seeing so many connections and so many um, similar themes across what all the speakers were saying, and some of the like let's take sort of like the first theme of identity. Some of the speakers talked about it in the sense of how they have to bring their identity to work. And I'm thinking of like, Anthony Ritter talked about, you have to tell your story because nobody else is going to do it.
Mm.
But then other speakers talked about like the opposite. And I don't remember the exact quote, but Queen Quet talked about how, they called us emotional natives or something like that. And this idea that, uh, not she knows that she wants to bring her identity to the work, but there are times when specifically told that we can't. And I've experienced that in my career as well. Like there have been times where I've been allowed to be a Chamorro man working in conservation. But in general, I think conservation, which let's be honest, is sort of a liberal, elite, white led
Mm-hmm.
effort.
Yep.
um, it is like you're supposed to be colorblind, and I'm not allowed to. In many spaces, I'm not allowed to sort of start with, "Hey, I'm a Chamorro guy," and like this is important to the work that I do. But when I'm doing this work in the community, especially like when I go back to Saipan, like the very first thing I have to say is, I was born on Guam. I'm Chamorro. My parents are Ramon and Donna. And that and that sort of gives me the gravitas and the connection to the community, to the culture, and to the people to allow me to conduct conservation. So I could sort of what I just described with like on the identity side, each of the speakers said the same thing about all of the other four themes. And so we after a couple of days after the conference, we were back at home and we were looking at all the notes that we were taking, and we sort of said, hey, like there's these themes that really kind of emerge out of across all the speakers, and they're saying it in different ways,
Mm-hmm.
and they're talking about it through different life experiences and how it applies to different cultures and different geographies, but the themes are still there. And we shared this work with several people before we published it, and I gave a presentation to a group of Indigenous people earlier in the day, and like what I'm hearing is like people are like, yeah, this kind of works. And my hope is that I'm not really proposing like a definition, or we are not really proposing a definition for what Indigenous-led conservation is,
Mm-hmm.
but we're more providing a framework for understanding it in its different variants. That was I just made a Loki reference. Indigenous-led conservation will have different variants,
Right.
but if you can understand it through the lens of identity and knowledge and values, responsibility, and advocacy, um, if you're an Indigenous person, that it helps give you the vocabulary to explain who you are and your ways of doing and your ways of being and your ways of knowing. But then if you're and I'm going to say mostly white, but if you're a scientist or an NGO or you work for the government, it also gives you a framework to understand where some of these folks are coming from, because you may be having a really hard time understanding why this Pacific Islander is demanding that they be able to bring their identity into conservation work, when conservation work is supposed to be based on science, and
Mm-hmm.
it needs to be colorblind and applied to everybody. So that was kind of like the emergence of those five themes.
Interesting. I like that. It's kind of it's nice when you look at those five themes after the symposium, and you're like, these are what the common these were the common themes that were mentioned by different speakers. And the article is really well laid out. I'll put the link in the show notes, but it's got quotes from all of them, and you were pretty much, I know you were paraphrasing, but you were pretty much bang on in terms of what people were saying in terms of the identity. And so it's interesting to me, like when the title of this is of this article is scientists, NGOs, and governments can support Indigenous-led conservation, and so it's so that your hope for the article is for the readers, to the scientists, the NGOs, the government workers, to be able to take this and understand this. Is it not, are NGOs and scientists and governments not really taking this in, or haven't been taking this into account in the past? Is this something like were I guess I should reword the question, is were scientists, NGOs, and governments at the symposium?
Yeah, so yes, the answer to the scientists and NGO part, they were definitely at the symposium. I am less sure about the presence of governments. Angelo, did you notice any?
Yeah, I don't know.
Okay,
Okay.
yeah,
I don't
I,
know.
I think it was largely so lots of educational institutions, Andrew, a lot
Mm-hmm.
of non so NGOs,
Right.
non-government organizations, so environmental nonprofits, and just academics, lots of students, lots of aspiring students. So it really was a rich community.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that for this panel that I really enjoyed, and it was a little bit different than some of the other conference panels that I've either participated in or helped organize, is that they are very prepared and rehearsed, and we do lots of rounds of trying to figure out talking points, and there's just a lot of logistical prep that goes into it.
Mm-hmm.
And for this specific one, I think the sort of instructions and guidance we gave our panelists was, please talk about how you bring your identity and values to your work that you do every day. And it was just very free flowing and
Mm-hmm.
open. And I think that helped have the type of conversation that we were able to have in that room. Was everyone showed up and spoke from the heart and talked about what they wanted to talk about. And it was still really powerful, because in the end, when we were reviewing the notes, Angela and I were thinking, oh, look at these themes that are emerging. And it wasn't pre planned that that would be the conclusion we would arrive at. Um, so, yeah, I think that free flowing conversation model was just really great.
And
Absolutely.
just like an example of what Hamna is describing, so Anthony Ritter was the graduate student from Guam who was on the panel. We're both from Guam, both Chamorro, and nobody on the panel like told anybody else on the panel what our presentations were going to be about.
Mm-hmm.
And both Anthony and I used old family pictures from Saipan. Mine were mostly from Saipan, but his were from Guam. To sort of ground our talk and sort of like where we come from. And we just had like kind of a good laugh because we're like, oh, we did not like, who uses family photos in a science presentation to talk about what it is that we do. And yet here we are, we're talking about identity and conservation, and we both kind of did the same thing. And um, there was just a lot of synergies between the six speakers.
Yeah, I'd love to hear that, but it makes sense. It's like you said, it's part of your identity and who you are and how you approach things, and I think that makes complete sense. What was the feedback from people in the audience? Did you get any feedback? Did you send out any surveys after the symposium, or get feedback from anybody afterwards, directly afterwards, or even a couple weeks later from any of the people who were attending the symposium? Not the speakers, but the attendees.
Yeah, no feedback surveys, but we were hanging out outside of the conference venue, the room that we had, for I think a little bit over an hour after the panel, just fielding questions and having conversations. So the feedback was really good, and I know from just posting this on our various social media platforms and
Mm-hmm.
just letting colleagues know about it, we received a lot of requests for, will there be a recording? Will there be some sort of report or outcomes document? And people who couldn't be there reached back out over email and text messages asking how it went, and that they were really interested in learning more and seeing the results of the conversation. So we heard a lot of good things. Angela, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, there was a buzz in the room as it was happening, and like the team we assembled, just like all super charismatic.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, so we started off. Chief Ann Richardson from the Rappahannock tribe went first, and she's like the first female leader for tribe, I believe, and she's like one of there aren't there were there they female chiefs exist, but she's one of the few.
Mm-hmm.
And she just gave this great talk, and she kind of had the audience was just in her hands, and then Queen Quet took the stage. And oh my gosh, if you've ever watched her she's got a bunch of videos on YouTube. I mean, the woman is just dripping with charisma. Like, she's one of those people where like every word that comes out of her mouth is something that you want to tweet. She only talks in like sound clips, and like it's just an amazing talk. And by the time I went fifth, I think, or I went last. And by the time I came on, like people were already laughing. Like people actually had tears in their eyes from some of the earliest speakers. So it was a very very friendly crowd, and like and someone kind of described how the room was so packed, people were sitting on the floor, standing room only, and like people peeking in from the room, from the doorway in the back of the room. I felt like it was well received.
Now we have the five themes, and Angela, before we press record, we were talking about, you're saying how well the article's doing, and Hamna, you mentioned you're getting a lot of feedback. Obviously, you recorded the call, or the symposium, so a lot of the talk, so people can be able to just kind of be able to watch it whenever they'd like, which is great. From this, obviously you got what you wanted out of this symposium. What are the next steps? So this conversation is really a good conversation starter. The symposium's great. Will there be another symposium at a different conferences, or will there be more workshops just for Indigenous-led conservation? What are the next steps?
So I'm interested to see how this applies across different geographies and cultures. Um, we put in for a side event at the upcoming International Marine Protected Area Congress in Vancouver. It's going to be in
Mm-hmm.
February, and we're going to ask a lot of the same questions, but for the ocean.
Right.
And there's a number of proposed national marine sanctuaries in the United States, and they all have, well, not all of them, but five of them have various levels of Indigenous engagement, from like leadership and nomination to like involvement. And so I think we're gonna, the next step is to kind of do this again with maybe sort of an ocean focus,
Right.
and see if it's the same or if it's different. Um, ultimately this has to result in policy outcomes, right? So I like to say, when it comes to protecting nature, the who and the how is more important than the what. So, how do we operationalize some of these concepts in the scientific process? How do we uh, operationalize this in hiring and retention at NGOs? And then how do we operationalize it in the development, the designation, and the management of marine protected areas? And I don't know if I could, actually answer that question right now. I think that's
Mm-hmm.
still an area open for discussion. And a couple minutes ago, you kind of asked, like, has this stuff ever been done before? And the answer is, yeah, it's been done before. Like, we're not starting at zero. I
Right.
mean, Deb Haaland is the first Native American Secretary of Interior. So there's incredible leadership at some of the highest levels in the U.S. government right now. But I don't like, to a certain degree, I don't think there's like an agreed upon vocabulary on a lot of things.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like, one of the words that gets bandied about in a lot of discussions around conservation in the United States is this idea of co-management.
Right.
And tribes are sovereign nations within the borders of the United States, and the chiefs are like sovereign leaders of nations. And so when these protected areas overlap with indigenous territory, um, how do we manage that? And that is probably going to look different with the Department of Interior than with, like, say, NOAA sanctuaries, or U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service with the marine monuments out in the Pacific. So I think these are questions that a lot of the conservation NGOs are asking themselves these same questions, and a lot of the tribes, and then the territories are also asking themselves some of these same questions. And then kind of my role is sort of like a scholar and academic at the Center for American Progress is to talk to communities, talk to leaders, come up with, what are actual recommendations that we can give to the Biden administration to help operationalize some of these things. So, like, that's what we'll be doing. Right? That's what I'll be doing over the next 2 years.
That's amazing. That's quite the feat in terms of trying to operationalize all of this. It's obviously quite important, and the conversations need to continue for that people can access them. Being at conferences and everything is great because you're getting that in-person relationship. You're seeing these speakers be able to, speak in person. You get to see their charisma. And obviously the speakers that you've chosen for this particular symposium they stand out. You've had relationships with them before, but you did mention that there is a lot of diversity within, with Indigenous people within the U.S. How do you get access to the different Indigenous groups around the U.S. so that they can have a voice in this conversation to get to the point where they're included? That's a big feat. Is it possible to be able to get all of them involved, or as many as possible?
I think if you have the answer to that, you get to have my job, or you get to be my boss. That's like the $1 million question.
Right.
With there's a UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It's called UNDRIP, and there's this concept of free, prior, and informed consent. Um, and how you go about getting that free,
Mm-hmm.
prior, informed consent. Uh, with there's over 600 tribes in the U.S. Out in the Pacific, there's a whole bunch of indigenous groups. You kind of have to there's no one right answer.
Mm-hmm.
So when there's no one right answer, you have to do a lot of things, and so uh, there are, and the worst thing you could do is just put it in the Federal Register, and ask for public comments in the Federal Register, because you're
Mm-hmm.
not going to get the engagement that you want there. And depending on what institution you represent, you have different responsibilities, but you also have um, different uh, things that you can or cannot do, right? Um, so, as an NGO, there are things that I cannot do that the government can do. And the same is true of government. They cannot do the same thing that NGOs can do. So there needs to be a lot of working together,
Mm-hmm.
and there needs to be a lot of communication. And there's also a lot of siloing, and we this particular symposium, which was one symposium with 6 speakers and maybe a couple hundred people in the audience. We did it at a science conference. Would we have gotten the same outcome if we had done it at the conference for the National Congress of American Indians? Would we have gotten the same output if we did it at a conference more focused on, say, like agriculture, and
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, or fishing? And I think those are like bigger questions that I don't necessarily have the answers to, but
Right.
are worth exploring.
Well, I like the fact that you're going to different conferences with different subject matters. Going to Impact, which you mentioned earlier in Vancouver, upcoming. I believe it's in early 2023 or mid 2023. That's a great place to meet the people who will be working with different stakeholders. And this conversation, I feel, has come up quite a bit from the science side and the NGO side. And to engage with indigenous groups, but it just doesn't seem like it's been an equal aspect. When we talk about it, it doesn't seem like the side of the indigenous people have had equal say in these types of processes. So it's good to see that these conversations continue, and I'm assuming we'll start to see actions taken from this. Now, this is a question, and I'm going to just stop it right here for both of you. I'm going to ask a question about the Center for Biological Diversity. They just had their COP15, so I'm just going to ask a question on that. We don't have to air it, but I'm just curious to see your thought. But here's the question: is we just found out that COP15 for the Convention of Biological Diversity just came out with some of their priorities. This is a big international agreement. Do you know if there was a indigenous contingency or a number of indigenous contingencies that participated in these international agreements?
There were a number of participants. So there's at that particular conference there is an official indigenous organization. I don't know what specifically what it is, but like there is an official indigenous representation. But then like the governments and the NGOs, so the big NGOs that are advocating for this, they
Mm-hmm.
bring indigenous peoples. But then also indigenous-led organizations go there um, and have opinions that are unique to their particular worldview as well.
Gotcha.
So I saw a lot of indigenous opinions on media. I wasn't in the room, so I don't have
Mm-hmm.
a full understanding of to what degree um, indigenous voices were heard. And I imagine in the upcoming days, I mean, the decision came out like this morning. I imagine
Right.
in the upcoming days, that information will be written about at length.
From the perspective of like the National Ocean Protection Coalition, what are the next steps? Are we looking at impact, and there's going to be some work there, and what can we look forward to seeing more on this, and when can we look forward to seeing more on these types of conversations continuing?
Yeah, so Impact 5 is the conference name, and our team will definitely be there with Angelo. And I think for me as an early career advocate environmentalist in this space, Andrew, something that just was really powerful in my work and also from this conference was as as environmental professionals and people with jobs in this space, our actions and words and our work is really powerful. So, how we
Mm-hmm.
show up to work every day and what we choose to focus on and be curious about, and what kinds of questions we're asking, and if we're taking the time to reflect, process, and stepping back to look at the bigger picture, all of that has impacts on real communities and real policy outcomes. So for me, the takeaway that I shared with my other fellow, also early career professionals, was that we really can use our actions and privileges to drive meaningful change in the way conservation policy functions in this country. It's really incredible to be working in this at a time when the administration is so supportive and we are seeing good actions happening, and there's progress being made, of course, and we
Mm-hmm.
also have a lot of work ahead of us to change the ways of thinking and to rebuild knowledge systems to be inclusive and equitable and respectful of indigenous ways of knowing and highlighting what the community's priorities are. So that's both just really exciting and also a long road ahead of us. So we just have to keep showing up every day and continue doing this work.
I want to thank both of you for the work that you've done, to this up to this point, and what you're going to continue to do in the future on this type of subject. It's obviously extremely important to conservation in the future, and these conversations need to be had. And I look forward to the actions that are going to be taken, in the future on this, and the operalization. I'm not even sure if I said that properly, but essentially, seeing this put into practice, I'm looking forward to seeing that and having both of you on to be able to continue this conversation and let people know what's happening on this front in terms of making sure that Indigenous-led conversation continues, or is taken very seriously, not only within the U.S. but over here in Canada as well, and internationally. So we want to thank you so much for coming on the podcast, and we look forward to hearing from you in the future on this subject.
Thank you so much for having us, Andrew.
Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you, Humna, and thank you, Angelo, for joining us on the podcast. It was great to have you on. Great to be able to have this conversation, listen to the great outcomes that came out of this. I just think it's interesting how, normally when the symposium is put on, they ask the speakers, hey, here are the themes that we want to hit on. I thought it was interesting how Angelo and Humna mentioned that the themes were kind of taken out of afterwards, after the presentations were done. So everybody made their own separate presentations, and they came out with sort of 5 common themes from these 6 different speakers. Angelo even mentioning the other person from the Pacific Islands, trying to get their name here. I believe it was Anthony Ritter from the University of Guam, and Angelo from the Mariana Islands. How they both incorporated family pictures at the beginning to kind of give them give the audience sort of who they are, give an idea of the audience of who they are, like their identity, which is one of the major themes. So I thought it was just really interesting how they didn't speak before, but this is how they expected to put on a presentation for the audience to get to know them. I just think that's really, really interesting. So having those 5 themes identified after the symposium is powerful. It's powerful because although all the speakers were different, and they had different cultures and they had different backgrounds, they kind of had the same 5 themes when it comes to their thoughts on Indigenous-led conservation. And we're not going to define, as Angelo said, we're not going to define Indigenous-led conservation because it's different in every culture, in every Indigenous sort of group. And I think that's really important to acknowledge. So I'm really hopeful that these conversations and these symposiums will happen again and again and again, because the more we have these conversations, the more it gets out, the more people are able to attend, the more people are able to listen, and then we can react and act based on those outcomes, on those conversations, on those relationships that are built at these symposiums. So if you have a chance and you're in the the ocean sort of realm, you're in the ocean conservation and science field, and you're able to attend some of these conferences where these symposiums are taking place, I highly recommend that you attend and participate in them as much as possible and listen and have those conversations. I think it's going to be really important in the future, because without Indigenous-led conservation, there's really no conservation in a lot of places. We saw the statistics: 5% of the world are Indigenous people, but they protect 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity. That's a huge stat, and they've been doing it well their entire existence. And so we need, as sort of conservationists, as scientists, we need to learn from them just as much as they need us. And so we probably need them more. And so I think it's really important to be able to emphasize that, to be able to acknowledge that, and to be able to include them, not only just include them, but have them lead conservation. I think that's really important. So we'll see what happens in the future with this. We'll be following. Angelo and Humna and I had some conversations afterwards of continuing these conversations in 2023. So I'm looking forward to that. And if you want to get a hold of Angelo or Humna, you can do so. Just look in the show notes. They've given me a bunch of links for you to follow. Also, the article is in the show notes as well. And I want to thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Speak Up for the Ocean Blue podcast. I'm your host, Angelo, and have a great day. I'll talk to you next time, and happy conservation.